I still love Jake. Marrying you was a huge mistake, she sobbed on our wedding night, so I calmly packed and left her alone in that honeymoon suite until she learned the truth about him. What should have been the beginning of our forever turned into the moment I realized I'd married someone whose heart belonged to another man. The irony wasn't lost on me that I discovered this in Las Vegas, where people come to gamble on impossible odds. I'm Marcus, 32, a financial consultant who specializes in helping people make smart long-term investments. For 4 years, I thought I was making the smartest investment of my life with Claire, a 30-year-old wedding coordinator who seemed to understand the value of commitment and planning. We'd met at a client's wedding where she was managing the coordination and I was handling the groom's financial planning. She impressed me with her attention to detail and professionalism, and our relationship developed steadily, built on shared values about creating something meaningful together. Our wedding at the Venetian was everything Claire had dreamed of, a testament to her expertise in creating perfect celebrations. The ceremony was flawless, with 200 guests witnessing what everyone thought was a love story reaching its perfect conclusion. The reception at the Bellagio was elegant and sophisticated, exactly the kind of event that would establish us as a serious couple in Las Vegas's social circles. Everything appeared perfect from the outside, the kind of wedding that gets featured in magazines. But perfection is often an illusion, and mine shattered completely in our honeymoon suite at the Four Seasons. Claire had been drinking steadily throughout the reception, and once we were alone in that beautiful suite overlooking the Strip, her demeanor changed completely. She sat on the edge of the bed still in her wedding dress, staring at her phone with tears streaming down her face. When I asked what was wrong, she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure anguish mixed with guilt. That's when she broke down completely and confessed that she'd been thinking about Jake throughout our entire wedding ceremony. Jake was her ex-boyfriend from college, someone she'd mentioned casually but never in a way that suggested unresolved feelings. As she sobbed in that designer gown, Claire told me that Jake was now a professional poker player traveling the tournament circuit, living exactly the kind of exciting, unpredictable life she'd always secretly wanted. She admitted that marrying me had been a terrible mistake, that while I represented everything stable and secure, Jake still held her heart in a way I never had and probably never could. The most devastating part wasn't just hearing that she loved someone else, but learning that I'd been chosen for my reliability rather than being truly wanted. Claire explained through her tears that she'd convinced herself that choosing security over passion was the mature decision, but standing there in our honeymoon suite, she realized she'd been lying to herself and to me. She said I was everything a woman should want in a husband, but that Jake made her feel alive in ways I never could. I stood there listening to my wife of 6 hours destroy our marriage with complete honesty, and something strange happened. Instead of falling apart, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Maybe it was my analytical nature, but I realized that fighting for someone who openly preferred another man would be futile and self-destructive. I walked to the closet and began removing my belongings from the garment bag, folding my clothes with the same precision I used for everything else. Claire watched in shock as I packed methodically, probably expecting tears or desperate attempts to salvage what we just celebrated. The aftermath of that wedding night created ripples through our entire social circle in ways I hadn't anticipated. My best man Tyler initially thought I'd abandoned Claire without reason, and he actually confronted me in the hotel lobby the next morning, demanding to know how I could walk out on my marriage after one day. I explained the situation quietly, and Tyler's expression shifted from anger to complete understanding. He told me he'd actually overheard part of Claire's confession when he'd come to check on us, hearing her sobbing about Jake through the door, and he admitted he'd been worried about my decision to leave until he realized the full scope of what had happened in that suite. My sister Emma was mortified by the family scandal, particularly how it affected our reputation in Las Vegas's affluent social circles where image matters significantly for business relationships. Emma works in high-end real estate and was concerned about how our family's credibility might be damaged by what appeared to be a failed marriage within hours of the ceremony. Meanwhile, Claire's family took a completely different approach, with her mother calling me repeatedly, insisting that wedding night emotions were normal and that I should give Claire time to process her feelings. Her father even offered to pay for marriage counseling, suggesting that all couples go through adjustment periods and that abandoning the marriage so quickly was an overreaction to temporary cold feet. The story spread rapidly through our Las Vegas social network, creating divisions that surprised me with their predictability. Most of the men I knew supported my decision, understanding that no self-respecting person should fight for someone who openly preferred another man, while many of the women urged me to be more understanding and fight for my marriage. The reactions revealed interesting perspectives about relationships and expectations, with some people suggesting that I should have been more romantic in trying to win Claire back from her fantasy, while others recognized that staying would have meant accepting a lifetime of competing with Jake's memory. Tyler became my unofficial spokesman during this period, fielding questions from mutual friends and explaining the situation when people pressed for details about why I'd left so suddenly. He told me that several people had noticed Claire's distracted behavior during the reception, mentioning that she'd been checking her phone frequently and seemed emotionally distant even during our first dance. These observations made more sense in retrospect, suggesting that Claire's confession wasn't a sudden breakdown but the culmination of feelings she'd been struggling with throughout our wedding day. During my investigation into what had triggered Claire's emotional crisis, I discovered Jake's social media presence, which painted a picture of exactly the lifestyle Claire had described. His Instagram showed him traveling to poker tournaments in Monte Carlo, Atlantic City, and Las Vegas, always surrounded by the glamorous atmosphere of high-stakes gambling and luxury hotels. The day after our wedding, he'd posted from Monte Carlo with a cryptic caption about knowing when to fold and when to hold, which felt deliberately timed considering the circumstances. His lifestyle looked exciting and spontaneous compared to my structured world of financial planning and long-term stability. What struck me most about Jake's online presence was how he cultivated an image of freedom and adventure that would appeal to someone like Claire, who'd spent years coordinating other people's perfect moments while potentially feeling trapped by the predictability of conventional success. His photos showed expensive restaurants, exclusive poker rooms, and exotic locations that represented everything opposite to the stable, planned future I'd offered. The contrast was stark and obviously appealing to someone who'd been questioning whether security was worth sacrificing excitement and unpredictability. Claire's voicemails started the day after I left, and watching them evolve over the weeks that followed became a fascinating study in human psychology. The first messages were pure panic, with Claire begging me to come back to the hotel so we could talk through what she called a terrible mistake brought on by wedding stress and too much champagne. She insisted that her confession about Jake was just cold feet and that she'd chosen me for all the right reasons, promising that she could forget about him completely if I'd just give her another chance to prove her commitment to our marriage. As days passed without any response from me, the tone shifted dramatically to anger and accusation. Claire left messages blaming me for abandoning our marriage without fighting for it, claiming that a real man would have stayed to work through the problem instead of running away like a coward. She said I'd proven that I didn't really love her by leaving so easily, and that maybe Jake was right about me being the kind of person who gave up when things got difficult. These messages revealed more about her character than her original confession had, showing me someone who could twist reality to avoid taking responsibility for her own choices. The most telling development came when Claire's messages began revealing her attempts to contact Jake for what she called closure. She admitted that she'd been trying to reach him through the professional poker circuit but hadn't received any response, which apparently shocked her since she'd expected him to be as invested in their connection as she was. Her voicemails became increasingly desperate as she realized that the man she'd destroyed her marriage for might not even be thinking about her at all, and that her fantasy of rekindling their romance might have been completely one-sided from the beginning. The final phase of her messages showed genuine regret and self-awareness that came too late to matter. Claire admitted that I'd been right to leave and that she'd destroyed everything meaningful in our relationship for an impossible fantasy that existed mainly in her imagination. She acknowledged that Jake represented excitement precisely because he was unavailable and unpredictable, while I'd represented the kind of genuine partnership that actually builds lasting happiness. Her recognition of this truth felt hollow because it only came after she'd lost both options. What surprised me most during this period was discovering that I felt peace rather than devastation about our situation. Instead of mourning the loss of Claire, I found myself relieved to have avoided a lifetime of competing with Jake's memory and wondering whether I was truly wanted or just settled for. The analytical part of my mind recognized that Claire's confession, though painful, had actually freed me from a relationship where I would have always been second choice. I realized that staying to fight for someone who openly preferred another man would have been self-destructive rather than romantic. The practical aftermath of our failed marriage involved a mountain of administrative tasks that kept me grounded during the emotional chaos. I spent weeks returning wedding gifts to guests, calling vendors to cancel contracts we'd signed for our honeymoon and first year together, and dealing with refunds for trips and services we'd never use. Each task felt like closing a chapter on the future I'd planned, but also like clearing space for something better and more genuine to develop. Friends and family offered various opinions about my next steps, with some suggesting I should pursue marriage counseling despite Claire's obvious feelings for Jake, others recommending a quick divorce to minimize legal complications, and a few advising that I should consider an annulment based on Claire's deception about her true feelings during our engagement. The range of advice reflected how unprecedented and complicated our situation was, but I appreciated having time to consider all my options without pressure to make immediate decisions about my legal and emotional future. 3 weeks after our wedding night disaster, Claire called requesting a meeting at our old favorite restaurant, claiming she had crucial information about Jake that would change everything about our situation. Her voice sounded different during that call, less desperate and more resigned, which made me curious enough to agree to meet her one final time. I chose a neutral public location where we could have a civilized conversation without the emotional weight of our shared history overwhelming the discussion, and I prepared myself for whatever manipulation or revelation she might attempt to share. When Claire arrived at the restaurant, she looked exhausted in a way that went beyond simple heartbreak, like someone who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and her choices. She ordered coffee instead of her usual wine, suggesting she wanted to have this conversation with complete clarity rather than the emotional numbness alcohol might provide. Her demeanor was subdued and almost businesslike, which immediately told me that whatever she'd discovered had fundamentally changed her perspective on our entire situation and her feelings about Jake. Claire began by admitting that after our wedding night confession, she'd made the impulsive decision to fly to Atlantic City where Jake was playing in a major poker tournament, determined to have the honest conversation with him that she felt would provide the closure she needed. She'd convinced herself that seeing Jake in person would either confirm her feelings and justify destroying our marriage, or prove that her obsession was based on fantasy rather than reality. Her plan was to appear at his tournament and finally determine whether the connection she felt was genuine or just her imagination running wild with possibilities. What Claire discovered in Atlantic City completely shattered the fantasy she'd been nurturing for months. When she arrived at the luxury hotel where the tournament was taking place, she found Jake living in a penthouse suite with Sophie, a fellow poker player who was clearly his girlfriend and business partner. Their relationship appeared established and serious, with Sophie managing Jake's tournament schedule and finances while he focused on playing. Claire realized that while she'd been fantasizing about Jake's freedom and availability, he'd actually been building a committed relationship with someone who understood and supported his lifestyle. The confrontation Claire had imagined as romantic and meaningful turned into an awkward and humiliating encounter that revealed how little she actually knew about Jake's current life. When she approached him in the hotel lobby, hoping for a private conversation about their shared history, Jake treated her politely but coldly, making it clear that their college relationship was ancient history that held no significance in his current world. He introduced Sophie as his partner without any awkwardness or attempt to hide their relationship, showing Claire that she'd been completely irrelevant to his life for years. Claire's description of that meeting was painful to hear, not because I felt sorry for her, but because it illustrated how completely she'd misunderstood both Jake's character and her own motivations. She admitted that Jake had seemed genuinely confused about why she'd traveled across the country to see him, treating her appearance as an unwelcome disruption to his tournament preparation rather than the dramatic romantic gesture she'd envisioned. When Claire tried to reference their college connection and the feelings she thought they'd shared, Jake dismissed her concerns as nostalgia that had no place in his adult life. The most devastating moment for Claire came when she realized that Sophie represented everything Claire had thought she wanted but had been too afraid to pursue independently. Sophie was confident, successful in her own right, and genuinely supportive of Jake's career without needing him to provide security or stability. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than the financial dependency and emotional neediness that had characterized Claire's approach to relationships. Claire saw what a healthy partnership looked like and recognized that she'd been seeking a fantasy rather than building something real. As Claire continued her confession at the restaurant, she revealed the most damaging truth about our relationship that I hadn't previously understood. She admitted that she'd been in secret communication with Jake for months during our engagement, sharing details about her doubts and receiving exactly the kind of attention that had fed her fantasy about their connection. Claire showed me screenshots of their text exchanges on her phone, revealing flirtatious conversations where Jake had been manipulating her emotions while carefully hiding his relationship with Sophie from her completely. The messages painted a picture of emotional manipulation that was both calculated and cruel, with Jake sending just enough encouragement to keep Claire interested while never making any concrete promises about their future together. He'd responded to her messages about wedding planning stress with suggestions that maybe she was settling for the wrong person, and when she'd shared photos from our engagement party, he'd commented that she looked like she was trying to convince herself she was happy. These conversations had been happening throughout the period when I thought Claire was fully committed to our relationship and our future together. The most devastating revelation was that Jake had sent Claire a message the night before our wedding, telling her that he'd been thinking about their college relationship and wondering what might have happened if they'd stayed together. He'd written that seeing her wedding posts on social media made him realize he might be missing someone special, and he'd suggested that it wasn't too late for her to reconsider her choices if she wasn't completely certain about marrying me. This message had apparently triggered the emotional breakdown that led to her wedding night confession, meaning that Jake had deliberately sabotaged our marriage from a distance. When Claire had appeared at Jake's tournament suite in Atlantic City, desperate and ready to abandon everything for him, his response had been brutally honest about his true intentions. He'd told her that their texting had been harmless fun for him, a way to boost his ego by staying connected to someone from his past who clearly still had feelings for him. Jake had called her pathetic for traveling across the country based on some flirtatious messages, and he'd suggested that she return to her husband and try to fix the life she destroyed through her own poor judgment and unrealistic expectations. Claire spent the rest of her Atlantic City trip watching Jake and Sophie from casino lobbies and restaurant bars, observing their relationship and realizing that everything she'd imagined about Jake's feelings for her had been completely fabricated in her own mind. She saw how Jake treated Sophie with genuine affection and respect, planning his tournament schedule around her career needs and including her as an equal partner in both his professional and personal decisions. Their dynamic was everything Claire had claimed she wanted but had never actually worked to build with me or anyone else. The contrast between Jake's treatment of Sophie versus his manipulation of Claire became painfully obvious during those few days of observation. While he'd been sending Claire mixed signals and feeding her doubts about our relationship, he'd been building something real and substantial with Sophie, someone who supported his goals without needing constant reassurance or financial security. Claire realized that Jake had never seen her as relationship material but rather as an ego boost and a distraction, someone whose attention flattered him without requiring any real commitment or emotional investment on his part. What struck me most about Claire's confession was how it revealed the depth of deception in our relationship that went far beyond her feelings for Jake. She'd been actively undermining our engagement while pretending to plan our future together, sharing our private moments and struggles with another man who was using that information to manipulate her emotions. The betrayal was more extensive than I'd realized, involving months of lies and secret communication that had poisoned our relationship from within while I'd remained completely unaware of the emotional affair happening parallel to our engagement. Armed with Claire's confession and the evidence of her text messages with Jake, I decided to pursue an annulment rather than divorce, filing papers that cited fraud and misrepresentation as the basis for dissolving our marriage. The text exchanges Claire had shown me provided clear documentation that she'd entered our marriage under false pretenses, maintaining an emotional affair throughout our engagement while deliberately concealing her true feelings and intentions. My attorney was confident that the evidence would support an annulment claim, essentially treating our marriage as if it had never legally existed due to Claire's deception during our vows. The legal proceedings moved quickly once the court reviewed the documentation of Claire's communications with Jake and her admission that she'd been in love with another man during our wedding ceremony. The judge found the evidence of fraud compelling, noting that marriage vows require honest intent and that Claire's secret emotional affair during our engagement constituted a fundamental violation of the commitment she'd made publicly. The annulment was granted within 6 weeks, officially erasing our marriage from legal records and allowing me to move forward without the complications of divorce proceedings. Claire's professional life collapsed almost immediately as our scandal became common knowledge throughout Las Vegas's wedding industry, where reputation and trust are essential for success. Her wedding coordination business lost several major contracts when clients learned about her personal situation, with many couples feeling uncomfortable hiring someone who'd destroyed her own marriage hours after the ceremony. The irony was striking that someone whose career depended on creating perfect weddings had become a cautionary tale about the importance of genuine commitment rather than elaborate ceremonies. Within 3 months of our annulment, Claire had been forced to close her business completely and move back with her parents in Arizona, unable to rebuild her professional reputation in a city where everyone knew her story. The Las Vegas wedding industry is surprisingly small and interconnected, and Claire's name had become associated with unreliability and poor judgment rather than the expertise and trustworthiness that couples expect from their wedding coordinator. Her fall from respected professional to industry pariah happened with shocking speed and completeness. Meanwhile, Jake's life became increasingly complicated as Claire's obsessive behavior escalated beyond their Atlantic City encounter. She began appearing at poker tournaments across the country, watching his games from casino bars and attempting to approach him during breaks, forcing Jake to involve casino security to maintain boundaries. Her stalking behavior became so disruptive that several tournament directors issued warnings, and Jake found himself having to explain Claire's presence to fellow players and tournament officials who were concerned about the harassment. The harassment campaign Claire launched against Jake and Sophie ultimately destroyed their relationship, with Sophie deciding she couldn't handle the constant stress of Claire's appearances at tournaments and her attempts to contact them through social media and poker industry connections. Sophie told Jake that loving him wasn't worth the drama and instability that Claire's obsession was bringing to their lives, and she ended their relationship after several months of escalating incidents. Jake's attempt to build something meaningful with someone who genuinely supported his career was ruined by Claire's inability to accept his rejection and move on with her life. Claire's stalking behavior eventually required legal intervention when she began contacting Jake's sponsors and poker associates, spreading lies about their relationship and trying to damage his professional reputation. Jake was forced to obtain a restraining order and hire private security for major tournaments, turning his career into a logistical nightmare that affected his ability to focus on playing poker at the highest levels. The irony was complete. Claire had destroyed not only our marriage and her own life, but also the fantasy relationship with Jake that had motivated her destructive choices, leaving everyone involved worse off than before her obsession began. In the months following our annulment, my life transformed in ways I hadn't expected, proving that sometimes the most devastating moments can become catalysts for genuine growth and happiness. I received a promotion to senior financial consultant at my firm, partly due to my increased focus on work during the aftermath of our marriage's collapse, but also because my experience with Claire had sharpened my ability to analyze risk and identify situations where people's stated intentions didn't match their actual behavior. My colleagues noticed that I'd become more decisive and confident in client meetings, no longer second-guessing myself or seeking approval for decisions I knew were correct. I moved to a downtown Las Vegas apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, choosing a space that had no connection to my life with Claire and represented a fresh start rather than an attempt to recreate what we'd lost. The apartment became a reflection of my actual preferences rather than the compromises I'd made during our relationship, filled with the kind of modern furniture and technology that Claire had always found too impersonal. For the first time in years, I was living in a space that felt completely authentic to who I was rather than who I thought I should be to maintain someone else's happiness. My financial situation improved dramatically without the constant drain of Claire's expensive tastes and impulsive spending habits that I'd been unconsciously subsidizing throughout our relationship. I was able to max out my retirement contributions, build a substantial emergency fund, and even start investing in a diversified portfolio that reflected my long-term goals rather than short-term lifestyle maintenance. The money I'd been spending on expensive dinners, designer clothes, and luxury experiences that Claire insisted were necessary for our social status was redirected toward building actual wealth and security for my future. 6 months after the annulment, I met Ruby at a hospital fundraising event where I was providing financial planning seminars for healthcare professionals looking to optimize their retirement savings. Ruby was a hospital administrator, 30 years old, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from managing complex situations and making difficult decisions under pressure. What impressed me immediately was how she asked thoughtful questions about investment strategies rather than focusing on my income potential or the lifestyle my career might provide for her. Our relationship developed naturally and honestly, built on genuine compatibility rather than the kind of intense chemistry that often masks fundamental incompatibilities. Ruby appreciated my methodical approach to planning and decision-making, seeing it as evidence of reliability rather than boring predictability. She had her own career goals and financial independence, which meant she chose to be with me because she enjoyed my company rather than because she needed the security I could provide. The difference between being wanted and being needed became crystal clear through my relationship with Ruby. What struck me most about dating Ruby was how she responded to the story of my marriage to Claire with understanding rather than judgment. Ruby recognized that Claire's behavior reflected her own character issues rather than any deficiency in my ability to be a good partner, and she actually admired my decision to leave immediately rather than trying to compete with Jake's memory. Ruby told me that my self-respect and boundary-setting abilities were exactly the qualities she valued in a partner, showing me that the right person would appreciate my standards rather than trying to lower them. The contrast between my relationships with Claire and Ruby taught me crucial lessons about the difference between being someone's first choice versus their safety net. Claire had settled for me while dreaming of someone else, creating a dynamic where I was constantly trying to prove my worth and compete with an impossible standard. Ruby chose me deliberately and enthusiastically, appreciating exactly the qualities that Claire had found suffocating. With Ruby, I never wondered whether I was truly wanted or just tolerated until something better came along. Through mutual friends, I occasionally heard updates about Claire's situation that reinforced my gratitude for having escaped our marriage early. She'd been working retail jobs in Arizona, struggling to rebuild any kind of professional reputation after her Las Vegas scandal became widely known throughout the wedding industry. Her attempts to restart her business in a new market had failed because her references from Las Vegas colleagues were either non-existent or diplomatically negative. The career she'd spent years building had been destroyed by a few months of poor judgment and obsessive behavior. The most telling detail I learned was that Claire had been in therapy, trying to understand why she'd sabotaged a stable relationship for a fantasy that was never realistic. According to friends who'd stayed in touch with her, Claire had come to recognize that her attraction to Jake was based more on escapism and fear of commitment than genuine compatibility. She'd apparently realized that she'd used Jake as an excuse to avoid the emotional vulnerability required for real intimacy, preferring the safety of unrequited feelings to the risk of building something meaningful with someone who was actually available. Jake's career had eventually recovered from Claire's harassment campaign, but not without significant damage to his relationship with Sophie and his professional reputation within the poker community. The restraining order and security measures had been successful in stopping Claire's stalking behavior, but the stress had taken a toll on his ability to perform at tournaments for several months. According to tournament reports I occasionally saw online, Jake had struggled with focus and consistency during the period when Claire was actively disrupting his events, costing him potential earnings and ranking points. Looking back on our wedding night and everything that followed, I felt no regrets about my decision to pack and leave immediately rather than fighting for someone who openly preferred another man. The experience taught me that authentic love requires mutual choice and genuine enthusiasm rather than just compatibility and shared goals. Claire's confession, though devastating at the time, had freed me to find someone who truly valued what I had to offer rather than settling for it while dreaming of something else entirely. As Ruby and I began discussing marriage and our future together, I realized that my experience with Claire had actually prepared me to be a better partner by teaching me to recognize genuine appreciation and mutual respect. I knew the difference between someone who chose me enthusiastically and someone who settled for me reluctantly, and I'd learned to value my own worth enough to walk away from situations where I wasn't truly wanted. The pain of that wedding night had ultimately led me to a relationship built on authenticity rather than compromise, and I couldn't imagine a better outcome from such a devastating beginning.